So we've been spending a long time in chapter 6. Let's finish it out. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13 and on. Actually, let's start with verse 12. Then you will not become spiritually dull and indifferent. Instead, you will follow the example of those who are going to inherit God's promise because of their faith and endurance. For example, there was God's promise to Abraham. Since there was no one greater to swear by, God took an oath in his own name, saying, I will certainly bless you, and I will multiply your descendants beyond number. Then Abraham waited patiently, and he received what God had promised. Now, when people take an oath, they call on someone greater than themselves to hold them to it. And without any question, that oath is binding. God also bound himself with an oath, so that those who received the promise could be perfectly sure that he would never change his mind. So God has given both his promise and his oath. These two things are unchangeable because it is impossible for God to lie. Therefore, we who have fled to him for refuge can have great confidence as we hold to the hope that lies before us. This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. Jesus has already gone in there for us. He has become our eternal high priest in the order of Melchizedek. So what did we talk about last week? Okay. And specifically that holding on to that is what keeps us sharp and is what keeps us from being, or rather what brings us into our hope, what brings us into receiving the reward that we're supposed to receive. It's what makes our faith real. This week, there's an example given, an example of Abraham. I got to tell you, I'm not really fond of this passage because it uses a lot of pre-knowledge. It uses a lot of context. So, not that I have a problem with the passage, but there's a lot of things that are sort of taken for granted by the author. One of them is the story of Abraham. Now that makes sense to be taken for granted if it's being written to who? The Jewish people. And it was. But it makes it hard for us if we don't know the story of Abraham, and specifically what promise is being referred to. So, what promise is being referred to? It's kind of the all-inclusive package, yes. Yep, that I will multiply your descendants. It's stated there, and then it says that he waited patiently. That's a very interesting passage, and a very interesting thing to say about Abraham, because if you recall, what happened with Abraham? Yes, what is the result for us? Well, Ishmael is the ancestor. What's the result for us of him not waiting patiently? The Middle East and Islam, yes. Those are all a result of Abraham not waiting patiently. Because what happened was, instead of waiting patiently, he had sex with Hagar in order to accomplish the hope that he had, that God was going to multiply his descendants. They had a child named Ishmael, and Ishmael became the ancestor of the forever enemies of the Jews. But here's what you have to remember about that story. Not to get all fundamental Adam and Eve on you. But you have to remember this about that story. Whose idea was that? And if Sarah had not had that idea, what do you think would have happened? Abraham would have waited. So, when it says that Abraham waited patiently, what we're talking about is the intent of Abraham. And I believe that there's some truth to that. It's a little bit muddled because Abraham was kind of an idiot. It's a little bit muddled because Abraham allowed something that was good of him to be spoken of as evil. But the reality is that Abraham's full intention And full belief was placed on the idea that God was going to bring about this child, and that this child would then be multiplied into descendants that, were numerous. And that through this child, the salvation of the entire world would come. And we know that that's the case, that Abraham had this mindset about this child, because when he was asked to give the child up, what did he do? He gave the child up. Which means that Abraham had a solid understanding of the hope that was going to come. And it wasn't just a solid understanding of hope, but it was one that was authoritative. It's one that Abraham was willing to act on. So, one could argue, and I'm sure that Abraham didn't take much to get him to argue this point, that it was a good thing for him to sleep with Hagar, because that was going to happen anyway. It was, of course, probably not the right head that was speaking, but with that said, should we question Abraham's ability to wait for God to follow through? No, I don't think that's really in question. It's muddied, for sure, but I don't think it's in question. Now there's this passage that talks about oaths and promises. And it's kind of a difficult passage because for us, a promise and an oath kind of seem like the same thing, but they're not. So you have this, well, let me read it to you. Now when people take an oath, they will call on someone greater than themselves to hold them to it. Without any question, that oath is binding. God also bound himself with an oath, so that those who receive the promise could be perfectly sure that he would never change his mind. So God has given both his promise and his oath. Now you have to understand that the relevance of this passage falls in the way that the Jews do things. It's also interesting to note that immediately after this, they say, this works because God, what do they say? These two things are unchangeable because it is impossible for God to lie. Now, of course, the cynic says, why? Why is it impossible for God to lie? So I'm going to give you a basic equation, okay? It's very simple. If God is God, meaning that he is everything. No, that's not right. That he is bigger than everything. If God is bigger than everything, if he is greater than everything, if he knows everything, if he is omniscient and omnipresent, omnipotent, if he is all those things, then from man's perspective, it would be impossible for that being to not be truth. Do you understand that concept? If we are going to think of something as authoritative in the whole, then it is, by its nature, 100% absolutely true. The moment that we see that it is capable of not being 100% absolutely true is the moment we remove godhood from it. So this thing comes to me like Sybok in Star Trek V. And says, I am God. This thing comes to me, this alien, Sybok in Star Trek V, Spock's half-brother. Spoilers. He comes and says, I'm a prophet for this alien. And this alien says, I am God. Come worship me. The moment that that God falls short of his godhood, which we think of as being omnipotent, omniscient, absolute in its ability to be true, is the moment we no longer think it's God. And that's exactly what happened with Captain Kirk in Star Trek V, was he was able to challenge the godhood of it by showing that it wasn't able to answer pure logic questions. In the same vein, sorry, I'll work on a more relevant reference. In the same vein, we only believe that God is God because when we put things in front of him, he stands up to that truth. If he didn't, we wouldn't think he's God. Therefore, another way to phrase this would be, it is impossible for God to lie and still be God. Everybody with me on that? Does that make sense? Okay. It's hard because we take these things for granted, or they take these things for granted because their culture accepts that. Our culture does not accept that. What did I say today in praise and prayer requests? There are multiple Christians at OG8 who don't even believe in a fundamental truth. Our culture does not take truth for granted. The Jews 100% take truth for granted. So for them, it's logical to say, God doesn't lie. For us, we're like, what are we like? Quid est veritas? What is truth? Make sense? So, God made a promise to Abraham. He can't swear on anybody because what does that mean? Everything is, as we talked about in doctrinal basics, everything is derivative. It's less than God. So for him to swear on that wouldn't mean anything. It might even mean the opposite. So he has to swear on himself. So in the presence of a promise, you have God giving both a promise and an oath. And it means something important. It means, according to the author of Hebrews, that we can 100% depend on God. Now, all of that is founded, of course, in the character of God as they understood it. But if there is a being out there that's 100% truthful and it swears upon itself, then we should be able to 100% depend on it. We should be able to have a confident hope. What is the overarching message of this year? Okay, so what we're talking about is the concept of trusting God versus blind faith. The way that Francis Schaeffer describes this is having a peg that's attached to the wall that you hang your coat on versus having a peg that is invisible and in midair. The moment you hang your coat on that, what happens? It falls to the ground. That is blind faith. What this passage is saying is, if God is in fact capable of meeting these qualifications, then in fact you should be able to hang your coat on it. Now he goes further and says that the real qualifier for the idea that this faith is real started with Abraham for us in specifically what instance? The moment the promise was made. It started with Abraham. It culminated with Abraham being willing to give his son up to be sacrificed. And it finished when Christ sacrificed himself. And that the foundation of our hope lies in Christ sacrificing himself. Now, there's a little more to it. You look at the passage at the end. This hope is a strong and trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. This is a very interesting choice of words. First of all, it denotes what? What is it denoting? It's calling a specific building to mind. Yes, the Holy of Holies is in a building. The Holy of Holies is the inner sanctum of the Jewish temple. Okay? So what would happen in the Holy of Holies? First of all, the Ark of the Covenant rested in the Holy of Holies. God's presence was there with the Jews in the Holy of Holies. And in that place, they would come before God. The high priest, only the high priest, would come before God after going through the curtain. He would sprinkle blood, sacrifice so that everybody could be saved, so on and so forth. But before he did that, what did he have to do? That happened, but even before that, he had to purify himself. He had to get ceremonially cleansed. Now you hear Pastor Dad always say, and he does it in his old English, whatever, that the curtain was rent. That's what he always says. What it means is that the curtain that stood between the Holy of Holies and the rest of the temple was torn when Christ died. We know this to be a fact, that the curtain was torn when Christ died. In other words, there was no division between the Holy of Holies, where God's presence was, and the outer temple. Anybody could go in. Didn't really matter because the Ark of the Covenant wasn't there anymore, but they still performed their sacrifices and stuff because, it's a money-making machine. So, with that said, the Holy of Holies was opened. What this says is that the hope is strong and trustworthy, is a trustworthy anchor for our souls. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctum. Jesus has already gone in there for us. He has become the high priest in the order of Melchizedek. What did the beginning of chapter 6 talk about? What? Yes, milky things. And what were the things that it talked about? Baptism, which is another way of talking about what? Ceremonially cleansing yourself. Do you see a connection? The beginning of chapter 6 starts talking about how people want to come before God and place their hope in things that are essentially milky. They want to get ceremonially cleansed. They want to be taken before God through a high priest. But the point that's being made here is, A, for the first part of chapter 6, why are you focusing on those things? That makes you dull. It makes you what you're not supposed to be. Turns you into being indifferent, capable of putting Christ on the cross again. Because remember, he's talking to Jews. But then he ends it by saying, the curtain has been torn. There is no need for you to go through spiritually cleansing things. There's no need for you to go through all of these things about doctrine and eschatology and all this stuff in order to make you close to God. The curtain is torn. What you need to hang your faith on, your hope on, is the fact that the curtain is torn. It's the fact that when we go through those gates, what do we find there? When we enter the Holy of Holies, what do we find? Okay, let me rephrase it. When we enter the Holy of Holies, who do we find? Christ. Notice the wording of this passage. It leads us through the curtain into God's inner sanctuary. Jesus has already gone in there for us. What's the direction man is to head? Into the Holy of Holies. Not to stand outside the Holy of Holies and allow a priest or an institution to come before you and sanctify you before God. We are supposed to follow Christ into the Holy of Holies because it's finished, because it's done. Our faith is meant to be hung on the fact that Christ finished it and wants us to be intimate with the presence of God. And intimacy with the presence of God does not look like discussions on ceremonially cleansing. It doesn't look like discussions on doctrine. It doesn't look like discussions on eschatology. All those things are valuable. But if you think that's what intimacy with God is, then you are dull, and eventually will become indifferent, and eventually will become capable in that dullness and indifference of putting Christ on the cross, which is really jacked up. So, The point that's being made here is trusting God means not staying outside in the temple courtyard. It means having the hope to be confident, to not tie a rope around your leg because you may pass out in the presence of God and they'll have to pull you out of the Holy of Holies, but to walk in there because Jesus is already there. So you have to ask yourself what being faithful and having hope and being intimate with God looks like to you. In this church, we're really good on those things, like doctrine and stuff like that. We do really well with it. We're also really good with intimacy. But when you think about yourself, do you think about yourself in the Holy of Holies with Christ? Or do you think about yourself in the outer courtyard? It's very, very important. And I think it's a valid question. Because it's good. Like the Jews were good that they would go to the outer courtyard and wait to be ceremonially cleansed. And that is good. But that's not where you're supposed to be. Are you waiting for myself and James and Pastor Dad to, bring the ceremony, to sprinkle the blood so that you can be right with God? Or are you coming in there confidently with us, just as we come in there confidently with Christ? Because belief in something is not the same thing as action. And there's a call to action here. So, I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what it means to have actual faith. Because faith should have hope, and hope should be confident. And if your Christianity is not confident in its intimacy with God, if it's afraid to be intimate with God, if it's afraid to not come, you can't come before God until you're ceremonially pure, or until you have all your doctrine in the right place, or until you understand your eschatology, or anything like that, we need to rethink that. So, go discuss.